Sego at Kunwaradu Sawaguego. Warm greetings to everybody. Kajitsakwas na yujats tanuwaganyato, kanyakahaga na kayato, tatanugana sadage aganagade. My name is Kajitsakwas Ellen Gabriel. I am from the Kanyakahaga or Mohawk community of Ganasadage, which is just north of Montreal. So thank you to come to the press conference for Land Back. Indigenous nations worldwide are at the forefront of maintaining biodiversity for the future of our planet and the next generations to come. Yet while state representatives are gathered here in Tiohtià:ke for the 15th UN Biodiversity Conference, Indigenous communities on Turtle Island, Abayala, and beyond are standing up against many of these very settler entities that threaten our relationship to the land and all its living beings. Whether claiming to be progressive or otherwise, UN member states who are gathering here purportedly to protect biodiversity are the very ones responsible for the land dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Human rights are interrelated, interdependent, and interconnected. The violation of one means that you cannot enjoy your human rights to the fullest. That is how we as Indigenous peoples see the world. The violation of Mother Earth means the violation of her peoples, our obligations to honor, respect, love, and protect Mother Earth and all our relations. From pipelines, chemical valleys, to forestry plantations and urban sprawl, industrial farming and mining, Indigenous peoples are facing loss of our lands and resources to the extractive policies of governments and capitalist interests all around the world. With this reality in mind, Indigenous Climate Action is releasing the executive summary of a new report, Indigenous-Led Climate Policy. The report is part of the second phase of Indigenous Climate Action's Decolonizing Climate Policy project and calls for Indigenous-led solutions such as land and water defense to fight the climate crisis and widespread biodiversity loss. As Indigenous people at COP15, we demand Indigenous-led solutions to the climate crisis and for our rights to be respected. Indigenous peoples are the protectors of biodiversity. It is through Indigenous-led solutions promoting long-term, sustainable development that we will see the world through this climate crisis. We demand that UN member states like Canada respect the right to self-determination as stated in various international human rights instruments. We demand that the field of human environmental rights be addressed together. And we demand that Indigenous peoples have the full and effective participation of any decision-making process at all UN meetings and fora, using the principles of free, prior, and informed consent as stated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and international human rights norms. There is no time to wait for targets as action is needed now. We should not tolerate lofty targets which, as history has shown, are never met. No amount of money will preserve the biodiversity for which we all rely upon. Only a deep mind change that understands that we as a species are responsible for the threats to biodiversity and all our relations. We must leave Mother Earth in a healthy state for the faces not yet born to have a fighting chance of survival. We must practice the one dish, one spoon, and take what we need so we do not impact future generations' needs. I'd like to introduce some of the speakers who will be speaking here today. To my left is Yaroslava Avila Montenegro, who is a Mapuche-born activist and raised in Toronto. She is part of Indigenous Climate Action here in Canada. From Brazil, and I hope I say this right, Kangang. Thank you. She is an Indigenous woman from the Kangang people in Brazil and is an anthropologist, PhD student, and is the vice president of the Kangang Institute. And then we have Achuar from Ecuador. Uyancar Domingo Peas Nampichicay is an Achuar leader from Ecuador with a history of serving the Indigenous movement. We also have from Wet'suwet'en on Turtle Island, Slado Molly Wickham, who is a land and water defender and spokesperson for the Gidimand checkpoint on Wet'suwet'en territory. Each speaker has 3 minutes, and I will introduce Yarrow to take the first round. Thank you.
Mari Mari Kampuche, Pupenyi Budamian, Yaroslava, Pinging Inche. I've come here to this platform at COP15 to denounce the injustices suffered by my Mapuche nation, who have been under occupation of the Chilean state for 130 years. The cosmology of our nation is based on the ancestral knowledge of the Kimun and the Kumimungen, as the yearning for life in harmony with all beings. This is precisely what my nation is trying to defend, that connection between all living things that is currently being destroyed by the capitalist and state interests in Waimapu and Mapuche territory, especially within the last 40 years between the transition from the dictatorship to democracy. This ongoing encroachment has been amplified to increasingly criminalize Mapuche people through laws implemented during the dictatorship that exists to this day. We're talking about Decree Law 701 subsidizing the forestry plantation industry, the Water Code, which privatizes most of so-called Chile's waters, the implementation of the anti-terrorist law. All of these things are connected to the Chilean constitution drafted by Pinochet in 1980. Because of this, forestry plantations hold 1.3 million hectares of land, holding 22% of the land mass in southern Chile compared to Mapuche Nation's 550,000 hectares. Two families hold 50% of the international lumber trade, El Grupo Mate and the Grupo Angelini. In 2006, a single company, Endesa, owned 55% of all shares of water rights in so-called Chile. Under this dire situation, Mapuche communities have increasingly mobilized to resist the encroachment and their rights to land and water, reclaiming lands owned by private landowners in an effort to reconstruct our Mapuche nation. And for that, they have been increasingly criminalized, with dozens of Mapuche land defenders having to face severe convictions, torture, and death to continue our land defense. Currently, under the Boric government, Manmapu has been under a state of emergency since May of this year. We have more than a dozen Mapuche political prisoners that are currently on hunger strike and have been for over 2 weeks. This includes Hector Yaitur and his son Ernesto, both members of La Coordinadora Arauco Mayeco. We call on the Chilean state to do its due diligence, to respect indigenous rights, to uphold the ILO Decree 169. And we call on the Chilean state to do the right thing. Free Mapuche political prisoners, forestry companies out of Waimapu. Amurebetay Waichan Marichiweo. Thank you. Chartumay. Hay que explotar.
Boa tarde a todos, todas e todes. Nós, povos indígenas, protegemos o planeta. E, de acordo com a pesquisa do Banco Mundial, nós somos 4% da população mundial e protegemos 80% da biodiversidade do mundo. Desde a colonização, nós enfrentamos o roubo das nossas terras no Brasil e o roubo também da biodiversidade nos nossos territórios. Nós, indígenas brasileiros, seguimos em luta para que o Estado brasileiro cumpra a Constituição Federal de 1988 e demarque os territórios que ainda estão sem demarcação.
We indigenous people protect the planet. According to the World Bank research, we are 4% of the global population and we protect 8% of the biodiversity of the planet. Since the colonization, we deal with the stealing of our lands and our biodiversity from our territories. We, indigenous people from Brazil, we follow our fight for the Brazilian government follows the federal constitution and give the title of our territories that should be demarcated since the federal constitution of 1988.
O Estado brasileiro precisa compreender que a demarcação dos nossos territórios interfere diretamente na proteção da biodiversidade e no combate às mudanças climáticas. Demarcar terras indígenas é garantir a vida para os nossos povos, mas também para a biodiversidade.
The Brazilian government needs to understand that demarcate, entitle our lands, interferes directly to the protection of the biodiversity in the struggle of the climate change. Give the titles of the indigenous territories is to guarantee the life to our people and to the biodiversity. We have.
Nós temos no Brasil a invasão de terras indígenas por madeireiros que devastam as nossas florestas, provocam desmatamento, pela mineração que contamina, né, os nossos povos com o mercúrio, as nossas águas, mata as nossas crianças com os equipamentos que são usados para garimpar as nossas terras, como a draga, que levou a vida de 2 crianças Yanomami ainda nesse ano.
Here in Brazil, we have the invasion of our territories for different threats, like the logging, the mining that's impacting children, is dragging children for the rivers, like the dragon that killed 2 indigenous children from Yanomami people.
Na COP15, buscamos mais espaço para o diálogo com os Estados-nação, especialmente aqueles que têm se comprometido em defender a biodiversidade e os povos indígenas. Que o documento final dessa conferência contemple as nossas demandas dos povos indígenas do mundo, pela garantia da biodiversidade no planeta e pela preservação da vida.
In this COP, we look for space to dialogue with the nations, with the countries, and we also are fighting for the final document in this conference. That the final document in this conference, including indigenous peoples and our demands to guarantee the biodiversity for our planet, the biodiversity in the planet and the biodiversity in the indigenous territories.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Primeramente, saludar y agradecer a los medios de comunicación, a la gente que está presente aquí y a todos los que me escuchan en este medio.
Good afternoon. I want to start with thanking the members of the media that are here and all of you who are in attendance and everyone who is currently listening.
Estoy presente aquí como achuar indígena de la Amazonía ecuatoriana peruana, representando a Cuencas Sagradas, una alianza programa para conservación de bosque primario en pie.
I'm here as a member of the Achuar Nation of Ecuador and Northern Peru, representing the initiative that's based on protecting and conserving standing forest in the Amazon Sacred Headwaters region.
Más importante, solidarizarme con los hermanos indígenas de Canadá y a todos los indígenas del mundo que algunos gobiernos han desalojado de su territorio. Mi solidaridad y pedir a todos los gobiernos del turno que ese derecho sea devuelto, ese derecho sea respetado por los gobiernos del mundo.
I'm also here to express my deep solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Canada and Indigenous peoples everywhere in the world where governments have forcibly forced them off of their lands, and demand that Indigenous peoples' lands are returned and that their rights are respected.
Este momento estamos en un crisis. La Amazonía del mundo es el corazón de todo continente. Por lo tanto, todos tenemos que cuidar y vivir dignamente de esta Amazonía que nos da vida a la humanidad.
I'm here because the Amazon is in deep crisis. The Amazon is the heart of the planet. Without the Amazon, there is no life. We all need the forest to live and dignify in a dignified way.
Hay que olvidar la historia que pasó. Ahora hay que deponer los intereses personales. Ahora tenemos que crear un nuevo camino entre todos. Indígenas, no indígenas, jóvenes, hombres, mujeres, sabios y sabias, empresarios, tenemos que juntos crear nuevo camino.
We have to put history behind us. We have to put aside our personal interests. We have to work together as all members, indigenous and non-indigenous, to be able to carve a new path forward. Young people, women, scientists, governments, business people, wise wisdom keepers, we have to come together in order to chart a course forward for all of humanity, for all life.
Agradezco esta presencia y decir que hagamos un trabajo juntos. No es hora de pelear, es de caminar juntos este momento. Muchas gracias.
I want to thank you all for listening and call on everyone to say that it's not a moment to fight, it's a moment to unite. It's a moment to work together in a joint force for the well-being and common interests of all. Thank you so much.
Denise Tsakaize Skyze Sai Slato Sydney Wet'suwet'en is Den. My name is Slato Molly Wickham. I come from the Wet'suwet'en Nation. We are a sovereign indigenous nation within so-called Canada, British Columbia, that have never ceded or surrendered 22,000 square kilometers of territory that is currently under attack by the Canadian, the provincial government, and private industry. Canada has been attending the COP, and they're touting that they're world leaders in biodiversity, that they're protecting large land masses within so-called Canada, that they're providing money, millions of dollars to Indigenous people to work on biodiversity. At the same time, on December the 8th, while Canadian representatives are working in this international stage, the Coastal GasLink pipeline has been devastating our territory. A 670-kilometer fracked gas pipeline that has never received the free prior informed consent of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, our true governance, the jurisdiction holders over all 22,000 square kilometers of lands. On December 8th, the Coastal GasLink pipeline used explosives to inch closer to Tselkaikwa. The explosives were meters away from this protected area, this sacred area to our people, less than a kilometer away from where Girimden checkpoint stands, where our people are utilizing our land at our village site. Tselkaikwa is otherwise known as Lamprey Creek. It's a spawning ground and home to blue-listed lamprey eels that only come to this part of our territory that was once a staple food for our people to rely on. This is following on the heels of them starting to drill underneath the Witzinkwa, our sacred headwaters, during peak salmon spawning season. They currently have gone portion of the way under the headwaters. After they had cleared old growth in caribou recovery habitat. We know that our very existence relies on the biodiversity in our territories. The very existence of my children, of their grandchildren, relies on our ability to be who we are as Wet'suwet'en people. We have the jurisdiction on biodiversity. We have the jurisdiction to control our lands and to manage them according to our laws, to our Anaknuaten. We are under attack and we are being invaded by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police 24/7 on our lands. That has to stop. We have to have accountability within our territory. We are the jurisdiction holders within our territory, as all the other Indigenous people on this panel are. Awatsa, Masai.
Ani Buju, Vanessa Gray, Indigenous, Amjanong Donjaba, Anishinaabe Dao, Makwa and Dodem. My name is Vanessa Gray. I'm from the Amjanong First Nation, and I'm Anishinaabe Kwe, and I'm from the Bear Clan. Amjanong First Nation is surrounded by a cluster of petrochemical refineries, also known as Chemical Valley. The companies regularly spill harmful chemicals into communities like mine. Imperial Oil, Suncor, Shell, and Enbridge are just some of the companies massively contributing to the growing climate disasters, jeopardizing the quality of life for all future generations. While Canada celebrates the historic colonial relationship with the fossil fuel industry, these same infrastructures are also aging, only to become more dangerous for the health and safety of my community and the Great Lakes. We all play a part of the climate solutions, and Indigenous solidarity plays a critical leadership role in the protection of the traditional lands and territories. Our inherent connection to our land and culture is still healing. Our culture is deeply rooted to the land and waterways. If the land is not respected, our culture and traditions are at risk. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers. So this is about land back. For centuries, Indigenous peoples have been squeezed into smaller and smaller pieces of land. And yet those pieces of land are still being taken and stolen from us. What land back means to us is the freedom. It's democracy. It's our voices being heard. And so I would like to conclude this portion and open it up to people who have questions. And given the amount of time we have, no comments, just questions, please. So if there's anybody out there who has questions for the speakers, please raise your hand.
Question for Roselia. I just want to know firsthand, from your perspective, what were the impacts of the Bolsonaro government on Indigenous rights and environmental protection?
O governo Bolsonaro não demarcou nenhuma terra indígena e foi uma promessa de campanha dele. O governo Bolsonaro flexibilizou a legislação ambiental no nosso país. O ministro do Meio Ambiente do governo Bolsonaro disse que ia usar o momento da pandemia em que nós perdíamos vidas indígenas, mas vidas também da sociedade como um todo, para passar a boiada, para destruir, para implementar a mineração nas nossas terras, para implementar a retirada dos nossos direitos.
The Bolsonaro government didn't entitle any indigenous territory, and it was a promise of his government. He promised this during his campaign. The former Environmental Ministry, Ricardo Salles, said that the pandemic moment was a moment that we should make flexible to make easier our environmental legislation. So to make it weaken all the compromises with the environmental and biodiversity protection.
Nós tivemos em vários momentos a vinda, né, da força do Estado contra os nossos territórios que estão em processo de luta por demarcação. Nós perdemos muitas vidas nos últimos 2 anos. Nos anos do governo Bolsonaro, as lideranças indígenas foram criminalizadas para além de ter vidas indígenas perdidas pelos nossos líderes, ter sido assassinados também pela mão do Estado.
During this government, we have a lot of pressure of policies invading our territories. We lost a lot of lives because of the violence against us, against our people during this government, during these last years.
E para fechar esse pensamento, nós tivemos durante o governo Bolsonaro muitas empresas do norte global influenciando diretamente nos nossos territórios indígenas a invasão para a mineração ou para a produção de commodities. Só que tudo isso resultou em muita violência e morte dos nossos povos, mulheres, crianças, os nossos anciãos.
And just to conclude, in these years as well, we had a lot of pressure and a lot of the companies from the global north invading our territories for mining, for producing commodities, and this also resulted in lots of violence and lots of death killed from our people.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions for any of the speakers? Young lady in the stripes.
Thank you very much. Luis Gio for Politico in Iran in Brussels. Yes, I'd like to know from your perspective, what kind of safeguards are you looking for to be in the final COP50 agreement? I'm especially thinking about the target that countries are negotiating on protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. What kind of safeguard would you like to see to ensure that rights of indigenous people and local communities are respected? And also, second question, how are you, if at all, engaging with negotiators here on the ground, and do you feel that they are listening to you and your demands on this particular question? Thank you.
So maybe we could ask Kangang, if you, or Molly, if you want to answer that question.
One of the main things that needs to be incorporated within COP15 and in general within these international conferences is to be able to implement the language of rights that already exists within the international realm. There is the ILO Decree 169, that there's language there that can be adopted, which I know that is incredibly incredibly controversial currently. At the very least, we need to have the language that is already there to be able to have that respect towards Indigenous peoples at the very least with UN DRIP, and that is just that's just the bottom floor. That's the base of what needs to happen. There is much more that needs to happen in terms of the actions of individual governments, as well as each one of us have been presenting in terms of the internal policies as well that each of these different countries are imposing on Indigenous peoples and the encroachment into each one of our lands. So that would be the floor to be able to implement international legislation that already exists. But there's much more work that needs to be done.
Would anyone else on the panel like to answer that question? What are you hoping to come out of this meeting?
Yes, I think accountability is one of the biggest things. We know from experience that Canada's commitments to Indigenous people and to our lands have always been empty and used as a tool to gain or maintain control of our territories and our resources. So not only do places like this, where there are policies being developed, those things we know that there is legislation to protect our rights and to protect our land. We know that those things exist, they just aren't being implemented. What I had just mentioned, all of the things that are happening on the ground, those things, the policies that exist are being violated already. So not only do we have to have, specific language around getting out of our way so we can do the work that our ancestors have been doing for thousands of years, that we already know how to do and that we are doing. We've never lost our land. We're controlling our land, but we're being criminalized, thrown in jail, and having violence done to us for doing that, for upholding our laws. So there has to be some accountability measures in what is actually happening on the ground, rather than at these huge conferences where it all sounds really great, but we see a totally different thing happening in our territories.
Concuerdo mucho con la compañera. Tenemos algunos países la constitución bien escrita. En Ecuador tenemos una ley aprobada por nuestros asambleístas, derecho de la naturaleza, pero no hay práctica en la realidad. Las acciones faltan. Entonces es momento de que los gobiernos cumplan con las promesas que se hace en cada eventos internacionales.
I agree with my sister here. For example, in Ecuador, we have a really powerful law in the constitution around the rights of nature, but these laws are not being implemented. That there's action missing. What's missing is action. And that this is a moment that we call on governments to comply with existing legal frameworks that already exist for protecting nature and protecting our rights.
En la Constitución dice que deben garantizar los gobiernos los derechos del pueblo y también derechos de la naturaleza. Eso hay que practicarlo. Donde están perjudicados, donde han desalojado, tienen que devolver para que ya haya este acuerdo mutuo entre Estado e indígenas. Esas prácticas exigimos en todos los eventos.
In our constitution, we have very powerful laws that say both the rights of nature and indigenous peoples have to be respected. But in practice, this is not happening. There's being violation of these rights. And where rights are being violated, where people are being displaced, governments need to return the land. They need to solve the problems that they're creating. This is the message we have in every international gathering, that the governments respect rights of people, rights of nature.
Lo más importante en crisis climático que estamos ahora, tenemos que ya diseñar conjuntamente todos. Y el bosque en pie es más importante para toda la humanidad. Y los que destruyeron hace décadas de años ahora tienen que contribuir para la reforestación, para la restauración, para la conservación de lo que tenemos. Solo así vamos a estar todos con buen vivir. Muchas gracias.
We are facing a climate crisis, that the existing forests that still are standing are important for all of humanity. The Amazon, for example, these need to stay standing. In designing solutions, we need to be involved. Indigenous peoples need to be involved. And we need to think about all of humanity. There's been decades of destruction, decades of deforestation and destruction. In those areas, we need to force countries and companies to engage in reforestation, restoration, and conservation. Only working together that we can find a path forward for the well-being, for the common good of all life.
Mesmo que nós saibamos que a gente não está com a implementação de tudo que a gente já tem, das legislações, nós precisamos garantir nessa COP15 que em todas as metas os direitos dos povos indígenas estejam presentes, que as vozes dos povos indígenas e o diálogo que nós temos tido até agora com os governos estejam presentes. As metas precisam garantir os direitos e ser mais ambiciosas do que são.
Even we know that the legislations that we have are not being implemented, we need to guarantee in this COP15 that the indigenous people's rights should be in all targets. So even we know that it must be difficult to be implemented, we must guarantee targets with our rights and much more ambitious.
The lady in the back that had her hand raised, there was another question.
Hi, I was just wondering, in terms of national and provincial parks here in Canada, how would you specifically like to see land back in terms of those conservation areas?
In Canada, there's federal and provincial jurisdictions, and Indigenous people are the ping pong ball that goes in between. And one will say it's not, we don't want to violate this, and the other will say, we don't want to violate this. In the meantime, Indigenous peoples don't have a right to access those lands freely. Those are traditional territories. Where I come from, there is Oka Park. We have been fighting, the settler colonial society for over 300 years, and we have lost more land. And these parks, they're great for recreation. Everybody can come snowshoeing. They can go skinny dipping. They can go in and bathe during the summer. But for Indigenous people, we don't have any rights. Canada is one of the worst countries. It looks like a really nice country to be in, and perhaps it is for some things. But for Indigenous peoples, we have to fight on a daily basis. You can conserve all the nature that you want. At the end of the day, Canada is the one that holds all the keys and the provinces, and Indigenous people's rights are disrespected. Even though there is legislation passed in June of last year to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they're talking about in 2 years, we will report on how it's being implemented. This is a province where the Francophone society thinks it can dominate us and does not see any systemic racism happening. So it's hypocrisy. It's a total hypocrisy to have national parks where Indigenous people are not allowed to enter unless we show a government-issued Indian Act ID that says this is our traditional territory. So discrimination is at its best in Canada, I think. And I don't know if anyone else has something to answer on that.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the times in our territory, I know that the parks have been used as a way to gain control over territory and land that belongs to the Wet'suwet'en people. And so in my perspective, Wet'suwet'en law is the umbrella. Everything else can fall under that. So if there are policies put into place around protected areas and parks within our territories, we may consent to that, but it's not going to come at the cost of us accessing our territories for cultural use. We can't hunt in the parks. We can't utilize. We can't harvest. We can't build our own homes on our own land if any of that land is considered or designated as a provincial park or a federal park. So we need our laws to be the umbrella, and then any protections under that can come underneath Wet'suwet'en law. That's how I see that happening.
We can take 2 more questions or 2 minutes? We have 2 minutes left. So if somebody has a question, a burning question, if not, the panelists will be here for later.
Hello, everyone. I arrived a little late, so I'm sorry if this was already brought up. I'm here with an NGO, and I work on Great Lakes protections. And in my work, something that I really want to forward is the concept of land back and really embed decolonization within the work that I do. But I do think that there's challenges that exist within the NGO, not-profit world in places like Canada where they're operating within colonial systems. And, I guess my question is, from the land defenders up on stage and Indigenous peoples up on stage, what kind of recommendations and advice would you give to the leadership of not-profits for how they can successfully integrate properly decolonization and land back into the work that they're doing when they're, as I said, working within these colonial systems that sometimes they're trying to do this in a way where they're playing inside game with politicians, and the concept of Canada comes in conflict sometimes with the concept of land back, right, and decolonization. So any kind of advice or recommendations you can give to people like myself who are working in these spaces?
I think that's a question that demands another press conference. So I don't think anybody here can answer it, but we do have challenges with NGOs. Perhaps, Molly, you want to take this one? And you have like 30 seconds left.
Quick answer, get behind Indigenous governance. We're not trying to make a better Canada. We're trying to uphold our sovereign nations, which is all of Canadian so-called Canadian land.
So at Conwarado, warm greetings. Thank you for attending this press conference, and thank you to the CBD and the UN agencies and the technicians for helping us get this off the ground. I wish you a good CBD and protect Indigenous knowledge from being commodified. Nyawa.